Addiction expert, speaker, and best-selling author Dr. Gabor Mate is not afraid to call it as he sees it. As Eric Kerr and expert and recovering addict Joe Polish found out when they joined forces to talk to the good doctor.
Or we are going to be talking about healing addiction in the context of family and parenting. And when Joe first introduced you and I brought up this topic and the opportunity to interview about this subject, he said, well, they're not really going to like what I have to say. Why did you say that?
In my view, addiction is not an individual disease. It's not a genetically determined problem, nor is it a choice that anybody makes. It actually is a response to experience. When I ask people what they get out of their addictions, whatever it is, whether it's substances or behaviors, they'll say, I get pain relief, I get distraction from stress, I get pleasure, I get a sense of control, I get not to feel alone, I get a sense of connection. In other words, what I'm saying about the addiction, it's always a solution to a problem. And the problem is that of emotional pain, of too much stress, of isolation, of lack of control in your life, of lack of pleasure in your life. And then the next question is, if the addiction is a solution to a problem, then how did the problem arise? And how the problem arises in every case is some childhood experience that shuts off your capacity to experience pleasure, that gives you a lot of pain that you can't handle, that overwhelms your system so that you're stressed in a way that you can't handle the stress, that isolates you from other people, that isolates you from yourself. So if that is the case, if the addiction is a solution to a problem, at least an attempted solution, and if the problem arises in life, if you look at where in life it arises in the family of origin. And that's not to blame anybody. It's just to say that trauma is passed on multi-generationally from one cohort to another. But some families find it hard. They'd rather believe that the individual has got a disease that they somehow inherited, rather than to consider that what the individual is actually dealing with is a problem that's rooted in the family, not due to anybody's fault, but because of people's unconsciousness and people's own unresolved trauma. As a parent, I passed on my trauma to my children. All parents do. And some families find it somewhat daunting to look at. Having said that, I've also had people whose children have overdosed and died thank me for my perspective, because they finally understood what happened. So no blame is intended in my perspectives, but some people sometimes interpret it that way. So that's why I said some people might not like it.
In your book, Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers, it reads, the secret of parenting is not in what a parent does, but rather in who the parent is to the child. What are the important distinctions between who you are to your child and what you do to your child?
Or with your child, yeah. Well, in North America, parenting is considered to be a skill set. So there's all these how to parent books. So in other words, like, there's a problem, your kid does this, then this is what you do. So it's sort of like a how-to set of tools and behaviors and skills that you employ. But parenting is not a matter of skills. Parenting is actually a relationship. If you look in the animal world, what allows an animal to parent her offspring is the relationship she has with them. It's not that she is taught a set of skills. It's that because of the bonding, the attachment that happens between infant and parent of any species, birds and mammals in particular, because of the bonding, there's a relationship that builds up. And it's in the context of that relationship that the parenting happens. And so that for the child to want to maintain that bond and to feel secure in that bond, the parent has to be a source of safety and nurturance and acceptance for the child. If a parent, with all the best intentions of the world, because of their own trauma, because of their own rigidity, because of their own anxiety, because of their own depression, because of their own stress levels are so high, are not able to provide that safety, that nurturance, that emotional presence, that attunement, that connection to the child, then what the parent does in terms of skills and techniques doesn't matter. The child is not in a position to receive them and to benefit from them, because for the child to be able to receive all that, they have to feel absolutely safe and open and vulnerable. So without the safety of that relationship, which really depends on who the parent is, rather than specifically what they do, the child does not have a context in which to benefit from the parenting. And so much of the time, what parents are taught actually runs counter to the relationship, because parents are often taught, for example, a 2-year-old, to punish the kid if they have a tantrum by a timeout. When you give a timeout, you're actually saying to the child that I'm available to you only when you please me, so that my love for you is very conditional. That's not what the parent intends, but that's the impact of that particular skill or behavior. And who the parent becomes for the child is a threat. And then the child moving from safe and open and vulnerable, now they can't receive the learning, they can't receive the teaching, they can't receive the values and the parenting. So again, it's who the parent is in terms of how nurturing they are, how soft they are, how available they are, rather than what they do that makes the difference.
So, Joe, as you hear this and you think back on your childhood, which I know was fairly traumatic for you, what do you hear and compare and think about when you hear what Gabor has to say about that?
Well, basically, that's what I resonate with is he's definitely extraordinarily knowledgeable in the area of attachment. And when we first had our first conversation a couple of years ago, he nailed me because I started talking about and probably minimizing what had happened to me as a child. My mother died when I was 4, being molested as a kid, never having any sort of female upbringing because my father never remarried. And so for me, it was a very dysfunctional childhood, but I would minimize it and I would compare it to other things because that was part of the way that I coped with it and tried to make sense out of it. But there's this, I actually wrote this down, something that Gabor said. If you were looking at a plant that was not developing properly in your garden, you wouldn't start blaming it for making the wrong choice. You would ask what conditions are lacking, soil, irrigation, sunlight, watering the plant. Essentially the same question we have to ask: what conditions do children need for healthy development, and what conditions are available to them today? And when I was a child, I was not in very healthy conditions, so therefore it made all the sense in the world as to why I developed addictions later in life. First starting with drugs and alcohol as a way to escape the pain, and then the second part, what became behavior addiction: sex, work, performance, all of that. And part of, it was there was not very good attachment. There wasn't bonding. There was never safety. And so, like what Gabor mentioned, with I never felt safe as a child and as an adult. So it started with the pain. The question that Gabor always says, the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And so where it started was just that lack of even feeling love and connection, and who do I even trust? Because my caregivers were the same people that in many cases abused me and neglected and all that. But I didn't know any better, because how does a child make any sense out of that,
So, Gabor, in the event that children don't create that attachment or that connection to the parents, regardless of circumstance, and Joe grew up in a very difficult and traumatic and extreme circumstance, in my opinion, but there are a lot of people who do suffer from that kind. What are the risks? Where does a child go to seek that attachment?
So here's what we'll be able to understand about all birds and mammals, and especially human beings, but not exclusively human beings, is that our brains are wired to attach. So our brains are actually wired to connect with other creatures. And we're biologically set that way because without that connection, we can't possibly live. So a little bird, a fledgling, cannot live unless they're connected to the parent. There's just no survival for them. So there's a biological drive to connect. There's also a biological drive on the part of the parent to connect with the infant, because again, without that, the species couldn't survive. So this is biologically, instinctively given in our brains. So we have this instinct, this drive to connect with a caregiver or a care receiver, and that's called attachment. Now, the brain can't handle the absence of an attachment focus, what we call an attachment void, so that even as an adult, when you lose a relationship or a friend disappoints you, your immediate instinct is to turn to others for support, because your brain wants to fill that lost attachment with another attachment. Now, for infants and children, this is not negotiable. They can't handle it. So the example I give is the duckling, that when the duckling hatches from the egg, he imprints on the mother duck, which means that he'll follow the mother duck around. That's a biological imperative. But when the parent is not there, when the duckling hatches, the duckling is still driven instinctually and biologically to attach. And the duckling will imprint on a dog or a horse or a moving toy, anybody. In other words, it has to fill the void with somebody. And they'll start following that toy around as if it was the mother. Now, human infants are the same. Human young children are the same. They can't handle this void of attachment. So when the attachments that are necessary for their life are not available to them, for example, when the parents are not around the whole day because the kid is in daycare, the child still has to fill that void with somebody. And who they fill it with is whoever's around. And in our culture, who's around for most of our kids, most of the time, from an early age on, are other kids. So now children transfer that biological attachment drive from parents to other children. And the problem is that the brain cannot handle competing primary attachments, so that you can't be in love with two people at the same time for any length of time. Your brain will eventually reject the one in favor of the other. And what happens is when children get attached to other children as their primary focus, which happens very quickly, then increasingly they detach from the parents. And now the parents lose that relationship in which they can actually parent the child. So when children live in a culture where peer attachment is fostered and even considered ideal and happens all the time, children become much more difficult to parent for the adults because they're not looking to the adults anymore. They're looking to each other for how to be and how to walk and how to talk and who to hang out with and so on. Now, this was contrary to human experience, because human experience is that we evolved for hundreds of thousands of years. We evolved in this hunter-gatherer grouping where kids were with adults the whole day. So what we have right now, from the point of view of evolution, is completely unnatural. When parents don't see their kids the whole day, it's totally unnatural. And so in this context, the child's brain, which needs the attachment, will connect to whoever's around. And in our culture, that's other kids. So now we have this desperation for children to be always on the cell phone, tweeting and emailing and texting and Skyping and Facebooking and phoning one another, because they can't stand to be without the attachment for 1 second. It's unnatural. It seems totally normal in the context of our society, but from a point of view of human needs and human evolution, it's completely aberrant. It's completely unnatural.
What are a few examples of healthy connection? Primarily I know this, it sounds, from my understanding of what I've read in the book and what you've explained here, it starts very, very early. And you used an example in the book when you put your finger in a newborn's hand, it will instinctively close. And that is an attachment reflex. So how do we initiate the attachment reflex as kids get older and into the more difficult times where I've raised 4 boys, and it seems like between the ages of maybe 11 and 15, it just got a lot harder to connect.
So it's a question of not how to initiate it, but how not to lose it. Because it's there right from the beginning. I mean, the infant comes out of the mother's womb and immediately latches onto the mother's breast. and then you see very early the kid's eyes are seeking the mother's eyes. So it's all there instinctively. The question is, how do we lose it? Well, we lose it in our culture, first of all, by medicalized birth practices that interfere with the parent-child bonding. And you got a huge percentage of people who no longer deliver babies naturally. Kids have to be pulled up by forceps or increasing rate of cesarean sections. And where I live in British Columbia, Canada, there's an over 35% cesarean section rate, which means that the bonding is going to be interfered with. Then we no longer live in extended families and tribes and clans where women weren't alone with the kid the whole day in a house, isolated by themselves. The father's off at work and the woman is at home. What has to happen is there's all these women around, aunts and cousins, and tribal members, and they all parented together. So the woman had a lot of support, so she wasn't so alone and so overwhelmed by the task of looking after the baby. And then, of course, in Aboriginal contexts, parents carried their kids everywhere. They didn't put their kids down. I know that amongst the Cree in Canada, I was told that kids didn't even touch the ground for the first 2 years. They were literally carried everywhere in the papoose by the parents, so that adults, so that there was a physical connection always maintained. So the attachment was always in flow. Aboriginal people generally don't let their kids cry. What I mean is, as soon as the kid cries, they're picked up. In our culture, we tell parents, let the kid cry it out, let him go back to sleep, which is writing roughshod over the child's attachment instincts. Because the child is crying because he's saying, pick me up, I need the attachment. And we're saying to parents, ignore that. So that your kid can go back to sleep, so you can go to sleep, you can go to work in the morning. So we have to reverse all that. And then the daycare situation. So in our society, again, we don't live in extended families, clans, and tribes. We live in these isolated nuclear families, and then the parents are gone the whole day. Now, if a child's going to go to daycare economically, if in our society we can't make it without both parents working, that's how it is, then at least we have to understand the importance of attachment. And when a kid goes to daycare, make sure that there's an adult there that's going to form an attachment relationship with the child, so that the parent hands the attachment baton to the daycare worker in the morning, and they get it back in the evening. But we keep the attachment drive in mind. We're conscious of it. We're compensating for what we've lost. And when a kid goes to school, the main job of the school is not to teach math and history or writing. The main job of the school is to provide a safe context in which the child can remain connected to adults, which opens up their own curiosity and their own channels of learning and their own spontaneous exploration of the world. And in the absence of that safety, that all gets shut down. So basically what I'm saying is, even in our culture, even with the necessary economic imperatives of parents having to work, if we just understood attachment, then we wouldn't be having all these practices that undermine it. And we wouldn't be telling kids or parents to have play dates and sleepovers at an early age so that the kids can have friends. No, we're saying that time with the adults is sacred. And the other thing you said about adolescence is, notice that in tribal cultures, over tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years really, practices evolved in which kids were initiated into the world at age 11 or 12 or 13, but initiated by who? What you meant? Who were they initiated by?
Initiated by their parents.
Exactly. By the adults, by the elders, by the parents. And so that transition from childhood to adolescence, which adolescence means becoming an adult, was not just left to chance. It was not just left to the peer group. It was carefully maneuvered and negotiated and guided by the adults. And in our culture, we've lost all that. So kids are initiated now into sex, into drugs very often, into all kinds of behaviors, not by adults, but by other kids. Well, we need to go back to initiating our kids. And we have vestiges of that, like the Jewish bar mitzvah ceremony. But it's only a vestige, because even in a lot of bar mitzvah, if you go to a lot of bar mitzvah events, you go to a formal religious part of it, but by the time it comes to the evening party, the kids are dancing in one room and the parents are dancing in the other.
So, Joe, as you listen to this, and what kind of peer groups did you seek out? Did you have this natural urge to seek connection and attachment to something?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I did it mostly. I was in isolation a lot, so I spent a lot of time by myself. I was a kind of a scared, introverted little kid. I was very shy. I smiled a lot, but underneath the smile, it was just the only way that I knew how to get attention and stuff. So every 2 years, my entire childhood, we would move, because my father, once things he had a weird sort of self-sabotage where once things started getting stabilized and there were some roots in the ground, he would uproot and want to plant somewhere else. It was kind of one of my father's way of coping in a, not a very healthy way. In Little League, I tried to play sports, but I had this sadistic Little League coach that would force me to hold the baseball bat in a certain way where I couldn't hit the ball. So that ruined my liking of sports. I did have a dog, and I loved that dog more than anything, because that was during the time where I had, the worst things happening to me as a child in a little town called Alpine, Texas. And I came home one day about a year after I'd owned this dog, and my father had given the dog away. And so that just, and so that was just sort of a real tremendously difficult thing. So I would kind of hang out with really sort of shy other kids. Like, we would find each other. And right when I started developing the relationships, we would, move. And so later, as a young teenager, I started doing drugs, and I started getting high. And so when you can find other kids in that sort of peer group that are numbing out, you tend to have a rapport with them, but it was all built around partying. But I'd like to ask, Gabor, is what's going on with the brain chemistry of when the kids are looking at computer screens, or when they're trying to escape? I'm curious, just the things that are actually happening in the brain, that the brain is, call it the brain, the body, the gut, whatever, is pursuing the things that make you feel connected, even if it's in a dysfunctional, artificial sort of connection, because that's all I was pursuing.
First of all, the attachment drive being the most powerful in human life, it just takes over. And so when our attachment needs are not met, we just spend all our time pursuing it, and then other considerations go by the wayside, and so the thinking parts and the intellectual parts and all that, we tend not to use them so much because we're putting all our energy into trying to get our attachment needs met. Number one, so that becomes the most important biological imperative. So if you want to free children to think and to play and to be spontaneous and to be creative, we have to meet their attachment needs so they feel secure enough so that other parts of the brain can now develop themselves and flourish. As far as computers and all that, there's two things going on. First of all, there's the seeking of attachment. So on Facebook, which is, and I think over 1 billion people on Earth, every 7th person in the world is on Facebook these days, which is it's incredible. What do people have? They have friends. And what do people do? They like each other. Now, friends and liking are attachment dynamics, they're attachment statements. Trouble is, they're not real attachments, because the person that people like on Facebook is not the real you. Because the real you is a body, and it breathes, and it speaks, and it has gestures and facial movements and body language and tone. Nobody sees that on Facebook. They just see a manufactured, curated image of yourself. So even when people like you on Facebook, you never really get the sense that they even know you. So that liking never satisfies. And so you want more and more people to like you precisely because it doesn't satisfy, which becomes typically like an addictive kind of thing. And the friends that you have on Facebook are very conditional, and people friend and defriend each other all the time. Now imagine if in real life you were defriended. You had friends, and all of a sudden someone says, "I'm defriending you." Just, the constant wounding that happens. So it's both addictive and illusory. Technologically, what happens is when you spend a lot of time on screen, it actually changes your brain. So in addiction, one of the physiological dynamics has to do with the chemical dopamine, which is the incentive motivation chemical, and we all love that dopamine surge. So when the gambler goes gambling, or the sex addict seeks the sex, and they're not using a drug, but they're still getting this dopamine surge in their brains, and all of a sudden they feel excited and motivated and alive. And the person who shoots cocaine, they'll get the dopamine surge as well, or nicotine, caffeine or crystal meth. But any addiction will drive the dopamine apparatus in your brain. Being on screens too much actually interferes with your dopamine receptors. So now you want more and more because you're not getting the same effect anymore. So from any point of view, whether it's the attachment aspect or the sheer impact of the screen on your brain, not to mention that all the time that you're on a screen, you're isolated from other human beings. I don't mean like in this kind of context. Screens can bring people together as well. Like there's the three of us in three different places in North America, but we're having this conversation, So technology can be used that way for sure. But much of the time, when people on our screen, they're on by themselves. They're just by themselves, further isolating themselves, even less contact with others. So those are the impacts.
So is there a correlation between the increasing levels of anxiety, both among adults and children and teens? I think I heard you say when Joe was interviewing you at Genius Network event, that a third of adults and teens are diagnosed with anxiety or depression right now. So, and this is a stat that is unprecedented right now as of the last 20 years when technology has really come up on the rise. Is there a correlation between that and why are we more depressed and why do we have higher levels of anxiety? And suicide rates, of course, have also gone up tremendously.
And especially amongst young people. The anxiety is the commonest, I should say, it's the fastest growing diagnosis in North America right now. And there's some studies that indicate that it's correlated to the rise in technology, the rise in the use of technology. But I think it has a deeper source. You see, anxiety is a form of fear. But it's a form of fear that's not specific. So if I was with you in a room right now and you pointed a weapon at me, I should feel fear. Fear is a helpful, healthy response. The adrenaline is going and your nervous system is on alert and you're in a vigilant, hypervigilant mode, always ready to escape or to fight, or tense up. But there's nothing happening to cause it. And that's what anxiety is. And how that begins with fear. Now we have fears of two kinds. We have fears if somebody's threatening us. We also have fear when our needs aren't being met. For example, if you didn't have water, you'd be afraid. Well, children's biggest need, as I've already pointed out, is their attachment relationship. Now, if you live in a society that consistently and relentlessly denies children their attachment needs, those kids are going to be afraid. When a child is alone at night and crying, he's afraid. And he's crying. And the crying is meant to wake the mother and the father and bring them and running to him to pick him up. But in a culture where parents are told not to pick up their kids, that fear is never assuaged, it's never soothed. It becomes intrinsic. So that our biggest fear is the loss of relationship. And kids are losing the nurturing relationship with adults all the time. And that's the source of the anxiety. And then we try to compensate for it by all the stimulation and all the technology. But of course, that doesn't work. It in fact increases it. So you got this spiraling cycle of anxiety vortex that begins very early in life and then continues and continues and continues.
At what point does a child start seeking what ends up becoming addiction in the process? How does a parent, anyone listening to this that could prevent it or that could help with it? I mean, I know that's not probably an easy question to answer. What are your thoughts on how does one, like, where does the addiction start and take root? And what could a parent listening to this do? Because I would imagine a lot of people listening to this as parents are struggling with their own addiction, with their own recoveries. Yeah. And, how do they become a healthy parent when they themselves are not even healthy? So I know I'm not sure there's an easy way to ask the question or answer, but I wanted to get your thoughts.
The first answer is rooted right in your question, which means that for the parents to be able to provide that relationship that's healthy and nourishing for the child, they have to be okay. Now, that doesn't mean they have to be perfectly okay, but at least they have to be committed to their okayness. So they have to undertake the healing in themselves. If I had understood just how unhealed I was when I was a parent to young children, I would have been a very different parent. But I didn't realize it, so I acted out all my stuff. So at least there has to be the recognition that, no, I need help myself and I need to work on myself so that I can be the person I need to be for my children. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you can see the addictive pattern in kids in infancy in a number of ways. The primary way is that addiction is self-soothing. I mean, you've already pointed out in your case. Addiction was a numbing, it's a self-soothing. You can see kids self-soothing. The relentless thumb sucking. Compulsive behaviors like I used to do, twisting my hair, which is like a form of self-soothing, till it was in a knot. The rocking that kids do, when a kid doesn't have their attachment needs, they'll do a lot of self-rocking, which is they want to be back in the womb when they were being rocked. The kids who are trying to soothe themselves all the time by sugar and eating and so on. The kids who are desperate for adult contact and will climb onto any adult indiscriminately as to who they are. So these early attempts at self-soothing are already markers of a future proclivity for addiction. And those children need to be not to be educated out of their thumb sucking. Or kids who are masturbating a lot in an early age. Because masturbating in children is a self-soothing. It's not healthy sexuality. Now, you don't do it by shaming them for masturbating. You do it by meeting their attachment needs so they don't have to self-soothe. The young children who have problems with stool, like they're withholding stool, we treat it with laxatives. No, the problem is that their nervous system is already reacting. The autonomic nervous system is already shutting down their bowels because of lack of attachment. So there's all these signals that we pick up in kids, but we see them as medical problems. But they're actually, what they really are is they're very clear attempts to ask for help from the adult world. And help with what? With the unmet attachment needs. So, yeah.
That was a really good question, Joe. My question is, it seems like, or my observation is, it seems like we're trying to push adult behavior on children way too early. Grow up, get along with other people, stop, any kind of behavior, stop crying. I can think of one which is just breaking my heart right now with my 15-year-old, where he grew a foot in a year. He was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and so he came back to go to wrestling, and his coordination and his height kind of off. He just wasn't doing as well. And he came to me in the stands after losing a couple in the beginning of the season and was looking for me to comfort him. And I said, well, this is not how you do this. You go and you kind of suck it up until the end of the meet and then come back. And I can see right now, that was, in my opinion, and I can see by your smile, that was the wrong response, which I have to go and correct with him now.
Well, what would you, so having said what you just said now, if you had this kind of consciousness then, what might you have said to him?
How are you feeling? Because he would hyperventilate as well. His breath would get short. And I would say, what you need to do is go breathe, go practice your breathing, but don't come up to me, because if I'm not here, I'm not going to be able to soothe you at the time that you need it most. So I was trying to prepare him for a future.
I'm asking, what would you say now?
I would just let him sit by me and put my arm around him, probably. I don't know what I would say.
Well, that's exactly it. And then you might also say, boy, it's hard sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah.
In other words, you just come on and you validate the kid's feelings. Because it is hard. I mean, what's it like for you and I if we playing a game and we lose as adults,
Yeah.
Never mind when your whole self-image is caught up in it, and you're a bit awkward and you're doing your best, and then so it's the kind of parenting mistake that I made over and over and over again. I mean, when I say that I've made every mistake in the book, I literally mean I made every mistake in the books that I've written, So I totally get it. But yeah, you would have come alongside and you would have just been with him and allowed him to have his experience. And you would have validated his experience. And then later on, you might have said to him, okay, shall we think of some ways to deal with this?
Yeah, and my fear was, what are other parents thinking, of me? And there was a level of embarrassment that my kid had to come up and sit with me when the other kids were down there seemingly okay.
No, so put that in the animal world for a minute.
Okay.
Let's say a bear cub gets frightened by a cougar and runs to the mother bear. Is the mother bear going to say, oh, what do the other mother bears think right now? My kid is a wimp, I mean, it's so unnatural, It
really is. I also want to talk in context of Joe, right? And people like Joe who are in parenting situations and scenarios which seem kind of hopeless and seem where the parents aren't probably going to change. What is the message to that individual who is saying, I don't have the attachment, my parents aren't creating the attachment, I never had the attachment? How do they bridge in a healthy way their current situation to one which they can create healthy attachment if it's not with their parents?
For some of these teens, dysfunctional as it is, the peer group is sometimes a saving grace. At least it gives them something. It might lead them in the wrong direction, but at least it gives them something. So not that that's ideal. But when you say, what do you say to somebody who says, well, implied in that question is that teen is talking to somebody. So already a teen who's talking to somebody and saying, I got this problem because I don't have connection with my parents, they're dysfunctional, they're using, they're fighting, their lives are chaos. Nobody listens to me. Nobody has time for me. But if they're saying this to somebody, then that's somebody that they're saying it to. And just as with your son, the 15-year-old, after the wrestling, you would come alongside and you'd say, yeah, that was really tough. Sometimes it's really hard going, isn't it? That's what you do. You say to them, yeah, that's really lonely. That's really scary. That's really hard. But the mere fact that you're doing that, you're providing exactly what's missing in their lives. So the Swiss psychotherapist Alice Miller, who wrote a lot about childhood trauma, she says that sometimes what saves kids is the presence of what she calls an empathetic witness. An empathetic witness is not a person who can change the child's situation, but at least can come alongside and validate the child's emotions. Because the real problem is that when there's nobody there to validate the child's experience, the child begins to mistrust their own experience and their own feelings. They begin to hate themselves. If you're there and if all you can say is, yeah, boy, that's really hard. Like, just imagine how lonely you must feel sometimes. That alone will shift the dynamic. And the child will say to themselves, oh, okay, my feelings are worthwhile. They mean something. They're not false. And somebody can actually recognize them. And somebody's interested enough in me to have listened to me. That mean maybe I'm not such a worthless person after all. So sometimes that's all you can do, but that's a lot already.
Well, what I would say, and I'll ask it in the form, I'll say a statement, but it'll be also in the form of a question for Gabor, which is for people that are, I know this is being watched and will be watched by thousands of people. And so I like having, Gabor's message getting out to as many people as humanly possible, because I consider him one of the top, if not the top addiction doctor mind in the world in many areas. And he's written a lot of amazing materials on it, which are available online. His book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, is the one on addiction. And there's many talks that he's done, which people can find on his website and through various other places. So in the pursuit of one's recovery and doing something about it, and all of our, goals of changing the global conversation about how people view and treat addicts with compassions instead of judgments, I'd like to ask Gabor, what recommendations do you have in the area from here with the conversation we've had so far? That I've more been an observer to, not necessarily a big participant here. What would you recommend that someone start with and do for not only improving parenting and getting healthy, but also for their own recovery? Anything that you would just recommend as suggestions of where to guide people?
Well, as far as parenting is concerned, there's parenting literature of two kinds. The dominant parenting literature is the behavior type, where how you change the kids' behaviors, which is missing the point entirely, because behaviors are only symptomatic. The real issue is, what is it symptomatic of? So there's a smaller but much more potent and much more worthwhile body of parenting literature that's based on attachment and fostering the attachment relationship. So if parents are going to look to guidance, they need to look to the attachment parenting literature, not to the behavior mode of parenting literature. So certainly my book, the one I co-wrote with Gordon Neufeld, Hold On To Your Kids, the work, the books of Daniel Siegel on parenting from the inside out, on his book on teenagers, Siegel's book on teenagers, Ross Green's work, other parenting people, Bruce Perry's book, The Child Who Was Raised as a Dog, about trauma in childhood. These are the sources to look to. And these are the people to seek out. People understand the attachment relationship as essential, and they're not focusing just on the symptoms, but actually on the basic context. As far as addiction is concerned, again, there's a large body of literature that looks at addiction purely as a disease or purely as a choice. There's a much smaller body of literature and teaching that looks at it as a symptom of deeper pain and emotional loss. And if people are going to heal from addiction, it's not enough that they concentrate on their behaviors of addiction, of how to be clean and how to stay abstinent, but actually how do we heal the trauma inside ourselves? So they need to look at the trauma literature. So my book that you kindly mentioned, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, John Bradshaw's work on trauma, Alice Miller's work on trauma, Bruce Alexander's book on social dislocation and cultural alienation as a source of addiction as well. You got to, if you want to look at the larger and the deeper picture, you have to look at that smaller body of literature. But again, naturally, I'm biased, but I'm biased because that's how I see it. You have to look to that rather than to the general behavioral approaches.
Great.
And you know, my works, as you mentioned, Joe, is available on my website, but it's also all over YouTube. So there's no cost to any of that. Whether you go to my website or whether you go to YouTube, nobody has to pay anything. And you know, if they want to purchase the books, I don't sell them personally, but they're available. That's my recommendation. And I think above all, I would say that whether they're approaching their parenting, like Eric, you mentioned about the guilt that you had thinking back to that episode when the son was 15. Well, I carried a lot of that. Let go of the guilt. I did my best. You did your best, given what you knew and what you understood and who you were at the time. Let's not look at our children through the eyes of guilt. Nobody else wants to be seen as somebody else's mistake, you know. So that one of my sons and I, Daniel, we do a program for adult kids and parents, and we just posted our most recent talk, and I made that point that so much of my time I looked at my kids through the eyes of retrospective guilt. But who wants to be seen as somebody else's failure? So we have to drop that too and see our kids for their possibilities and the process that's in them that's going to heal them. And we need to support that without laying the burden of our guilt on top of